They say grief echoes, but in Mourner's Hill, Oregon, grief did something far worse. It called. In the winter of 1864, long after the mining booms had faded and the timber roads began to rot underfoot, a hilltop orphanage stood as the last stubborn structure between wilderness and oblivion. It was known as St. Armatha's Home for the Bereft, but the children called it the House with the Midnight Door. Not because it had a door that opened at midnight. Most homes creaked and swayed in the wind. But because one door, an interior one, opened only at midnight and only when it spoke a name. Each night, one of the children would hear it first, a low murmur, as if spoken from behind thick glass. It always came just past the stroke of 12. One name. Just one. Then the door would click, swing inward, and the air would change. Those who entered never returned. Elias Monroe was 7 the first time he heard it, and when it whispered Avery, he did not sleep for 3 days. Avery Keller was the youngest girl in the orphanage, barely old enough to speak full sentences. She vanished the next night, not from her bed, but from the hallway just beyond the chapel, where she had been seen walking alone, humming a hymn only Sister Lillian ever sang. The records say she drowned in the river, though no one could explain how she left without anyone seeing. The snow had left no footprints. The doors were still bolted from the inside. The Hill's official ledgers list a dozen disappearances that winter. Privately, the number was 23. Sister Lillian Hart, who kept the books with severe precision, marked the lost children with only a black stroke across their names, and each stroke, over time, grew darker, as if the ink would not dry. Thaddeus Crane arrived the following spring. A former Union surgeon turned parish caretaker, he had been sent by the Archdiocese in Portland to replace the aging groundskeeper, who, they claimed, had taken ill and wandered into the woods. No one found a body, just a single boot in the snow and the man's brass spectacles wedged into the bark of an ash tree. Crane did not ask many questions. His arrival coincided with Sister Lillian's increasing isolation, a retreat from the children, from the prayers, from the world itself. She now occupied the east wing entirely, locked the chapel twice daily, and no longer received communion. When asked why she never left the grounds, she answered only once, "He has not finished speaking yet." And always the door, old, arched, iron-ribbed. No room on the other side, only a shallow recess in the stone wall behind the chapel stairs. Nothing that could fit even a small body, let alone swallow them whole. So how did they vanish? Elias, now 9, began to document the whispers in the margins of his prayer book. Every name, every night. He showed it once to Crane, who said nothing at first, only turned pale and asked, "Who taught you to spell Lillian's name?" "I didn't," Elias whispered. The door did. It was not just the children now. The cook, Agnes Doyle, went missing on Palm Sunday. A traveling deacon left one morning before Mass and was never seen again. His mule returned 2 days later, braying at the gate with something clutched in its saddlebag. The man's severed collarbone, clean as bleached bone. And still the church sent no investigators. No inquiries, only letters urging prayer and patience. Mourner's Hill was isolated. The world below the mountain had already begun to forget it existed. Sister Lillian stopped speaking entirely by July. She was seen only once a day, kneeling before the door, her palms flat against the frame, lips moving silently. Her eyes, when they caught the light, had gone nearly black. Then, on the 3rd of August, the door whispered a name none expected. Not a child, not a sister. Thaddeus. And the door began to bleed. Crimson ran from the keyhole like syrup from a tapped tree. Thick, slow, deliberate. Crane stared in stunned silence as it traced the grooves in the oak panels, branching into tiny tributaries that snaked across the floor. The children were asleep, or so he hoped, though one candle still burned near the infirmary. Elias's light, no doubt. The boy had developed the habit of waking at midnight now, keeping vigil with a seriousness no child should possess. Crane pressed a cloth against the bleeding door. It soaked through immediately, staining his fingers, his cuffs. It wasn't paint. It was warm, fresh. The smell was unmistakable. Copper and salt, thick with something older, something wrong. He backed away and turned, intending to fetch Sister Lillian, but she was already there. Silent, standing barefoot in her nightclothes, her hands folded neatly at her waist. Her hair, once bound with such precision, now hung in loose strands across her face. Her eyes held no recognition. "The name was spoken," she whispered. "You cannot stay." Crane steadied himself. "It was my name. That door has no room behind it. This is nonsense, a cruel superstition born from fever and fear." But Lillian only shook her head, slowly, mournfully. "Then open it." He didn't move. "I thought not," she said. By morning the blood was gone. No stain, no scent, no trace. The cloth he'd pressed to the wood, dry, unstained, folded neatly on his bed. Crane began to doubt himself. Sleep deprivation, stress. Perhaps Elias had whispered it, hoping to frighten him. But then came the second name. Not whispered this time. Spoken, as clear and sharp as a bell. Lillian. It echoed through the empty corridor like a summons, and Sister Lillian, who had not crossed that threshold in weeks, stood before the door within minutes. She did not knock, she did not hesitate. She opened it, and there was nothing. No stone recess, no empty crawl space. Just darkness. Pitch black and deeper than shadow. A darkness that breathed, that seemed to pull. The oil lamp in Lillian's hand sputtered and died as she leaned forward, 1 foot inside. Crane grabbed her arm. She turned slowly, her face unreadable, then whispered, "He's waiting for you too." That night, Elias locked himself in the laundry cellar. He had stopped speaking altogether. His prayer book lay abandoned under his cot, its margins now filled with names. Some crossed out, some circled, one scratched through so violently it had torn the paper beneath. Thaddeus. There was another detail. Crane discovered it by accident while sorting through old baptismal records in the West Wing storage room. A register, water-damaged and brittle, cataloguing all children who had arrived between 1859 and 1863. Every name was accounted for, except one. Elias Monroe. No surname, no town of origin, no baptismal date, no confirmation, just a name scribbled in the margin of another child's entry as if added after the fact, and one note beside it, left at the threshold during the thunder. Crane turned the page. More names, more black strokes. Then he stopped. There it was again. The bleeding door. A sketch, crude but unmistakable. Drawn in charcoal by an unknown hand, labeled in Latin, Janua Mortis, the door of death. He traced his fingers over the rough parchment. A slow realization spread across his spine. The door was older than the orphanage, perhaps older than the hill itself. That night, Elias stood in the chapel, barefoot, eyes glazed. "Don't go near it," Crane warned, but the boy simply said, "He doesn't want me." Crane asked, "Who does he want?" Elias looked toward the door, now silent, now still. Then he whispered, "The one who listens." The door creaked, a low wooden groan, not open, not closed. Waiting. Crane didn't sleep. By morning, Sister Lillian was gone. Her bed lay untouched, sheets drawn tight, pillow cold. The iron crucifix she wore daily hung from the window latch, swaying gently despite the still air. No one had seen her leave. The east wing remained locked, but the door, the bleeding door, was ajar. Crane stood before it just after dawn, lantern in hand, heart racing. Behind him, The orphanage stirred to life in muted dread. The cook refused to enter the chapel. 3 of the older boys wept openly during morning prayers, and Elias had begun to scratch lines into the stone floor near the confessional. 1 mark for each night, 1 mark for each name. Crane knelt before the door. The darkness inside it still breathed, that strange pulsing void, but it no longer beckoned. It only watched, as though it waited for someone to make the next move. "What are you?" he whispered. "What do you want?" There was no answer, only silence thick enough to choke on. Crane began to catalogue everything. Names, dates, times. He mapped the orphanage, every corridor, every stairwell, looking for patterns. The door's position aligned precisely with the east bell tower. At midnight, the moon passed directly overhead. The architecture, he realized, had not been designed for convenience, but for something older, something deliberate. The orphanage itself was a key, and the door, the lock. But what did it open? He confronted Elias again in the infirmary. "Tell me the truth, boy. Who taught you about the door?" Elias looked up from the Bible he no longer read, his eyes dull. "I don't remember learning. I've always known. It speaks to me when the others sleep." Crane hesitated. "And who does it speak for?" The boy closed the book and stood. "Not God. He doesn't come here anymore." That night, Crane lit every candle in the chapel. He scattered salt across the threshold, placed relics, a splinter from a saint's bones, a bottle of holy water, even the bishop's ring retrieved from the locked safe. But the door remained unchanged. The salt melted. The ring cracked, the relics blackened as if scorched by invisible flame. At midnight, the door whispered. But this time, it was not a name. It was a prayer, not in Latin, not in English, in something far older. Words that scraped against the mind like rusted blades. Words that Elias began to repeat in perfect unison from across the hall, his voice rising in a tone no child should possess. Crane tackled him mid-verse. The boy screamed, writhed, then collapsed. When he awoke, he remembered nothing. "I dreamed of snow," he murmured, "and a man made of wires." The next morning, Crane searched the grounds. At the edge of the forest, near the old root cellar, he found Sister Lillian's habit. Folded, unstained, laid atop a stone like an offering. Beneath it, carved into the earth, was a perfect circle, 12 feet wide. Inside it, symbols, sharp, angular, interwoven like thorns. One matched a carving on the chapel's foundation, a detail he'd never noticed before. He returned to the chapel. On the back of the altar, hidden beneath a decaying cloth, he found an engraving chiseled deep into the stone. "Et ostium patifiet, solum ad mortem," and the door shall open only unto death. That night, the door whispered again. "Elias." Crane froze. The boy was already awake, already standing in the hallway, his face calm. Too calm. "No," Crane said. "You're not going. Not tonight." But Elias did not move, did not speak. He simply pointed at the door, and for the first time, Crane noticed something he had not seen before. The darkness inside the door was not empty. It held eyes, watching, and behind them, a face. Familiar, smiling. It was Sister Lillian. Only, it wasn't. The face inside the door wore her features. Yes, the high cheekbones, the thin lips, the pale blue eyes now turned liquid black. But something behind that smile was wrong. Too wide. Too calm, as if the thing wearing her flesh was amused, curious, hungry. Crane pulled Elias back with trembling arms, shielding the boy's eyes. The door made no move. It remained ajar, still bleeding softly from the hinges, its breath like heat from a dying fire. But that smile, it lingered. Elias whispered, "She's not in pain. She wants me to follow." Crane spun him around. "That thing is not Sister Lillian. Do you hear me? She's gone. But she remembers me, Elias said softly. She said my name the way my mother did. Crane felt his resolve fracture at those words. For the first time he realized. He had no memory of Elias's mother. No record, no letter, no proof that she'd ever existed. Just a name scribbled into a ledger, just a boy with eyes too old for his face and knowledge that came from nowhere. Who left him here? And why? That night, Crane removed the hinges from the chapel door, boarded it shut with iron nails and crucifixes scavenged from every room. He slept with a rifle in his lap, the Bible at his side, and a broken relic clutched to his chest. But at midnight, the whisper still came. No name, no plea, just laughter. Childlike, familiar, terrifying. In the morning, the boards were intact, but the nails had bent outward as if something had pushed them from the inside. Crane confronted the diocesan offices in writing. Desperate letters, descriptions of vanishings, bleeding wood, the unnatural obedience of a silent child. He received no answer. Until one arrived in person. Father Alric Hennessy, sent from Portland under the guise of a surprise inspection. A tall man with sharp features and a voice like gravel soaked in wine. He arrived unannounced, carrying no luggage, no Bible, just a black leather valise and a look of irritation that bordered on contempt. He listened, stone-faced as Crane detailed everything. Then he dismissed it. Mass hysteria, frontier superstition. Your post requires discipline, not imagination. Crane showed him the prayer book, the names, the scratched-out verses. Alric scoffed. Children lie. Then Crane took him to the door. They stood in silence. The breath behind the door was faint but undeniable. Hot, measured. Open it, Alric said. I won't, Crane replied. Then I shall. He did. Inside, blackness, but no smile this time. No face, just whispers. Hundreds of them, too fast to follow, too many to understand. Then Alric staggered backward, clutching his ears. Blood poured from his nose. He screamed. Crane slammed the door shut. That night, Alric locked himself in the east wing and recited verses until dawn. By morning, he was gone. So was his valise. But on his pillow, he left one page, torn from a codex long since forbidden by the church. It contained a single passage. The door is not an entry. It is a mouth, and mouths must feed. Elias did not speak for 3 days. When he finally did, it was in his sleep. Crane found him kneeling before the chapel wall, eyes closed, lips moving. He leaned in, trying to hear. Elias whispered, "The face behind the door is wearing your voice now." Crane recoiled. That night he bolted the chapel shut and sprinkled ash in a circle around Elias's bed. Every candle burned low, every crucifix faced outward. But just before midnight, the house sighed. Every window cracked, every mirror turned black, and the door, the midnight door, split down the center like old bark in fire. From within, something stepped forward. It wore Crane's face. Not a distorted mimic or grotesque mockery, but his face, exact in every crease and shadow. The stubble on the chin, the faint scar above the left brow, the tired weight behind the eyes. Even the breath, fogging in the chill air, moved as his own did, but its smile was wrong. Too patient, too knowing, and the eyes, not his, not even human. Flat, dark, bottomless, like ink poured into 2 sockets where intention should be. Crane backed away, his heartbeat thudding like a war drum. Elias remained frozen near the hearth, watching the thing with eerie calm, as though he had expected this, as though he had dreamed it. The double stepped out into the chapel, barefoot, leaving no trace on the dusty floorboards. Its gaze never left Crane. Then it spoke. Not in Crane's voice, but in Lillian's. "Why do you resist what was promised?" Crane raised the iron crucifix, its silver edge catching what little moonlight pierced the stained glass. "You are not her. You are not me. You are nothing." The thing tilted its head, lips parting just enough to reveal perfect, bloodless teeth. "Then why do I remember the prayers you never spoke?" The crucifix vibrated in Crane's hand. Not from fear, from recoil, as if the sacred object recognized that this was no simple spirit, no restless soul, this was something ancient. "Where is Lillian?" Crane demanded. The double blinked slowly. She opened her heart to the silence. "She dwells now in the marrow of the house. You will join her." And then it vanished. No flicker, no burst, simply gone, like breath swallowed by wind. The chapel stood still again. The air returned to its damp heaviness. The midnight door closed behind it with a soft sigh. Elias exhaled for the first time in minutes. "I think," he said softly, "it's wearing more than your face now." Crane did not answer. He simply fell to his knees before the altar and prayed until dawn. Not for salvation, not for deliverance, but for knowledge, for understanding. Because something had changed. The rules were no longer fixed, and he feared that whatever had emerged no longer needed the door to cross over. The following days twisted slowly, like rope around a neck. The children, what few remained, ceased speaking altogether. Meals went untouched. Laughter became a sound Crane could no longer remember. The air inside St. Armathas thickened with dread. Time itself grew elastic. He could no longer tell if a moment passed in seconds or hours. Candles burned down in minutes, then lingered inexplicably for days, and then, on the 7th night, the mirror above the basin in Crane's quarters cracked, not shattered, cracked, down the center, from top to bottom, and from the split emerged his own reflection, smiling not just in the glass, but beside him. He turned too late. The thing's hand was already on his shoulder. It whispered into his ear with his own voice. "The first truth is this. You were never alone here." Crane lashed out blindly, struck nothing. The room was empty, but in the cracked mirror, the double lingered a moment longer, mouthing one final word. Soon, he ran to Elias, who was waiting in the corridor, eyes wide. "It told me where it comes from," the boy said. "Not the door. Not the chapel." "Where, Elias?" The boy looked toward the attic. "No one goes there, but the floorboards still bleed." Crane knew what he had to do. He took a lantern, the crucifix, the salt, the pages from Alric's bag, and he climbed. Each step moaned like a warning. The air thickened with dust and incense, as though the prayers of the dead had soaked into the beams. He reached the attic hatch. A child's handprint was smeared in blood across it, and above the latch, etched in nail scratches, were 4 words. "The door is hungry again." The words bit into Crane's eyes like frost. He stared at the attic hatch, the blood-slick handprint already darkening as it dried. He knew that if he opened it, something ancient would greet him on the other side, but to remain ignorant was no longer an option. Elias's warning, the reflection's mockery, the door's silence. They all pointed here. He pulled the hatch. It opened with a reluctant sigh. The attic was a low, cramped space beneath the sloped roof, filled with old trunks, broken cribs, rusted candlesticks, remnants of decades, perhaps centuries. The air was dry but foul, as though 1,000 moths had died mid-flight and left their breath behind. But it was the floor that drew Crane's eyes. A large circle burned into the boards. Not painted, burned. Scorched lines traced runes he did not recognize, shapes that seemed to crawl at the edge of his vision. He stepped around it cautiously, lantern raised. Something glimmered near the far wall. A mirror, but not a mirror meant for reflection. This one had no glass, only darkness, smooth and fluid like still water. As Crane approached, the surface rippled and began to show something beneath. A room, No, the room, the chapel, but twisted, inverted. Where the altar should have stood was a pit of roots. The pews, carved lovingly by the brothers who built the orphanage, were blackened, bent into claw-like shapes, and in the place of light, only pulsing red veins lined the stained glass, as though the windows had become eyes, and in the center stood Elias, or something wearing his shape. Crane recoiled. The mirror pulsed once, then went still. His breath came in bursts. He turned to leave, but paused at a creak behind him. A box, a child's coffin, half buried under moth-eaten tapestries, lid pried open. Inside, a bundle of letters, a lock of hair, and a birth certificate. Name, Elias Monroe. Date, March 6, 1857. Mother, Lillian Hart. Crane staggered back. The name repeated itself in his head. Lillian Hart, Sister Lillian. Elias was her son. But how? The timelines, the church records? It didn't make sense. Unless he was never supposed to find this. Unless the church had known. He returned to Elias, now seated in the west corridor, humming. "Why didn't you tell me?" Crane demanded. The boy looked up slowly. "She left me at the door," he said. "But not that door." Crane's blood ran cold. "You mean the one behind the chapel?" "No." Elias's voice became distant. "The first door, the one at the hill's root." He rose, barefoot again, and pointed beyond the walls. "Before this place was a home, before it was a chapel, it was his cradle. The soil remembers. And he needs names. That's all he ever needed." Crane fell to his knees. "You're not a victim, are you?" Elias blinked once, as if amused. "I'm a key." She tried to turn me away. That's why he took her face first. But she still sings to me in the dark. The boy's eyes changed, just for a moment, colorless, void, then back again. Crane stood, trembling. "Then I'll burn this place." Elias tilted his head. "That's what they all said. The last priest, the one before him, and the one before that." Crane felt it before he saw it. The heat beneath the floorboards. A pulse. A heartbeat. The orphanage was alive, and the door was no longer waiting. It was opening itself. Downstairs, the chapel bell rang. 12 slow tolls, but no one had touched the rope. Crane turned, lantern raised, heart thundering, knowing now that the hunger would not end with the house. It would end with him. The toll of the chapel bell echoed like a knell, deep and final. Crane stumbled down the attic ladder, nearly dropping the lantern as he hit the landing. The children, were there any left? He wasn't sure anymore. The halls felt emptier than death. No footsteps, no whispers, just the sound of wood stretching like muscle and the slow breathing of the walls. 12 tolls. Midnight, the hour when the door chose its name. But Crane didn't wait this time. He ran to the chapel, the lantern swinging wildly, throwing shadows that moved without cause. The door stood wide open now, no longer bleeding, just yawning into that impossible darkness. The crucifix he'd nailed to its frame had melted down the wall in long silver streaks. His name echoed softly from within, not spoken, but remembered. He stepped to the edge. Behind him, Elias appeared, silent as smoke. "You don't have to go in," Crane said. "You can still choose." Elias didn't respond. He pointed toward the door. "There's something it wants you to see." Crane knew. He entered. The transition wasn't like stepping into another room. It was like falling into a memory someone else had buried. The chapel behind him vanished. Ahead, a corridor that didn't exist on any blueprint. Lined with mirrors, each reflecting something different. Not his face, not even this world. One mirror showed Sister Lillian, younger, joyful, holding a child wrapped in linen. Elias, but her eyes were panicked. She kept looking over her shoulder as though someone, or something, pursued her. Another mirror showed Crane himself, not as he was, but as he had once been, laughing, dancing in uniform with a woman he no longer remembered the name of. And then, behind him, the door again. Always the door. He moved past it, breath shallow. At the corridor's end, a circular room pulsed with light like a beating heart. Roots lined the walls, pulsing with the same rhythm as the chapel's floor, and in the center, a well, shallow, ringed in bone. From it rose a voice. Not a growl, not a whisper. A memory. "My name is Thaddeus Crane," he heard himself. "I was born in Baltimore. I served in the war. I did what I had to do." Each word peeled itself from his own memory and dropped into the well. It fed on him, and the more it took, the more he felt his thoughts slip like water through fingers. He stumbled backward. His lantern flickered. Then Elias appeared beside the well, but not the boy, the one from the mirror, the one who wasn't Elias. It spoke with two voices, his and Lillian's, in unison. "You came here to fix something broken, but the house does not heal. It harvests." Crane dropped the lantern. It shattered. Darkness devoured everything except the boy thing's face, lit faintly from within, no longer pretending, its mouth stretched past the jawline, splitting like overripe fruit. "We were never children," it said. "We were always the appetite." Crane drew the blade from his coat, a consecrated relic, jagged and iron, one of the last that Alric had left behind. He lunged. The thing screamed, but not in pain, in joy. "You've named yourself," it cried, and then Crane felt it, the pull. Not from the door, from the well, his name, spoken over and over in hundreds of voices, young, old, male, female, all his. "Thaddeus, Thaddeus, Thaddeus." He dropped to his knees. "Why me?" he gasped. The boy thing leaned close. "Because you believed it could be stopped." The roots surged. The mirrors shattered, and the door behind him slammed shut. He was inside, and outside, Elias opened his eyes, smiled softly, and whispered, "One more name." The chapel grew quiet after the door sealed itself, as though the building had sighed in contentment. The shadows thickened at the corners of the room, and Elias, still barefoot, turned slowly from the door's wooden face. He looked neither afraid nor relieved, only expectant. He walked with slow steps down the main hall, each echo tapping like a pendulum in a room now devoid of time. The children's beds were all empty. The dormitories, stripped bare. No laughter, no crying, no breath. St. Armatha's home for the bereft had become something else, a skin stretched over a darker skeleton. In the corner of the eastern stairwell, the stone wall pulsed faintly. Underneath the faded tapestry of St. Veronica, a wet patch bloomed in the shape of a hand, not a child's, an adult's. Fingers spread wide as if clawing upward, reaching from the other side of the stone. Elias passed it without a glance. He descended to the old record room, the one locked since before he could speak. But now, it opened for him. No key, no resistance. The hinges sang a low groan like a throat opening to scream, but remembering it had no voice. Inside were shelves, floor to ceiling, each lined with the names of children who had passed through Mourner's Hill. Yellowed baptismal logs, death certificates, unsent letters from grieving parents, crumbling ledgers of births and donations. But there was one shelf different from the rest. It was black, not painted, but charred. The wood had been burned without flame. Ash danced in the air as Elias approached it. On the center of the shelf lay a single book bound in leather that moved faintly beneath his hand, pulsing like muscle. He opened it. Inside, names, but not the dead. Not the lost. The willing. Priests, sisters, midwives, surgeons. They had all served the door, some knowingly, some through small concessions. A whispered name, a delayed rescue, a single prayer reversed. All the names were signed in blood, and at the very bottom, scrawled messily across the last page, barely legible. Thaddeus Crane. Date of entry: preordained. Elias closed the book. He did not cry. He did not speak. Instead, he returned to the chapel and stood before the door, his arms at his sides. The boards no longer wept, the hinges no longer creaked. The door now breathed with slow, satisfied exhalations. "I've seen the last name," Elias said aloud, though no one else remained to hear. "You said there would be one more." The door remained still. Then slowly, the wall above it cracked, a hairline fracture running from the peak of the arch to the ceiling, splitting stone that had stood for generations. A voice emerged, no longer human. It didn't speak a name. It offered one, and Elias nodded. Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall, dry flakes that hissed on contact with the earth. The wind howled down the mountain path, but no traveler came. No letter arrived, no child was placed at the gates. Mourner's Hill faded from maps once more, as if it had exhaled its own existence. But inside, Elias stood calmly, hands folded behind his back, facing the door that had taken everything from him and given everything in return. He whispered a name, one never spoken aloud since the orphanage's founding, one hidden beneath centuries of rewritten scripture, of modified records, of lies passed from bishop to bishop like a rusted heirloom. He whispered, "Moloch," and the door opened wide, not into blackness this time, but into light. Red roaring living, and from within came the sound of hooves and weeping. The harvest had begun. What stepped through the door was not a creature. It was not something that could be catalogued by bone or muscle or instinct. It was a memory of pain made manifest, shaped into something with form, for the sake of those who still needed to see. The figure that emerged had no face, only a mask of ash. Its limbs were bent like broken crosses. Its hands carried bells that rang without sound, and behind it, dozens more. Some crawled, some floated, some sang. They did not speak names, they consumed them. Elias stepped aside. They passed him like he was part of the house now, a fixture, a sentry. His face remained expressionless, but his eyes shimmered with heat. From his pocket, he drew the page torn from the black ledger, the one with Crane's name. He lit it. The flame sputtered at first, then roared, devouring not only the paper, but the surrounding air. Fire raced up the chapel walls, but did not burn. Instead, it revealed script beneath script, names buried under layers of whitewash and prayers. Beneath the paint, beneath the wooden ribs of the orphanage, were markings, carved directly into the bones of the structure. This place had never been sacred. It had been a vessel, built to honor Moloch, not just as a shrine, but as a womb. The creature that wore ash for a face passed through the vestibule into the dormitory wing. One by one, the beds folded inward, collapsing like dying flowers. Toys dissolved to soot. Every echo of childhood was erased in its wake, and in the study, where Crane once kept his maps and ledgers, the floor opened into a mouth. Crane, still within the mirrored corridor beyond the door, screamed, but not from pain, from understanding. He saw now, as the walls around him pulsed with heat and light, what the door truly was. It was not a gate, not even a path. It was a mirror, a reflection of the desire to forget pain by giving it to someone else. And every time someone called out to God and heard no answer, they opened it a little more. Crane tried to run, but the corridor bent. It looped, it stretched, it brought him back to the same point. In each mirror, he saw a different version of himself. One hanged from a tree, one buried in snow, one clutching a child in flames, and then one smiling, sitting in the orphanage office, quill in hand, signing the foundation charter. 41, Thaddeus Crane. "No," he whispered. That's not me. That's not. But it was. He was not the first Crane. He was the same Crane. Returned. Over and over. The door had never fed on children. It had fed on him. On his failure. On his guilt. It had built the orphanage around him like a shell. And Elias. Elias was the only part that remained constant. He was the seed. The door's first offering and its last. Inside the chapel, the fires dimmed. The creatures faded. Their purpose fulfilled. The structure groaned once more, but did not collapse. It had never needed to. Outside, snow melted in a perfect ring around the building. The trees bowed slightly, their branches cracking with reverence. The mountain fell still, and inside the silent chapel, Elias knelt where the altar once stood, surrounded by ash and silence. He whispered to the void, "The cycle is complete." But the void whispered back, "Not yet." And in the corridor of mirrors, Crane turned one last time, face twisted in dread, as the sound of thousands of names screamed through him at once, and only one voice, his own, said the final word. Again. The word echoed across time, spoken not in desperation, but obedience. The corridor of mirrors cracked down its spine, each shard peeling away to reveal walls of flesh and root. Thaddeus Crane fell to his knees, not from exhaustion, but from recognition. His body trembled, but not from fear, from memory. He had said it before. He had said it many times before. Every cycle, every birth of the orphanage began with that word, a declaration, a submission. The door was not forced upon him. It had been accepted, bargained, welcomed, and the price, always the same. A child, a name, a forgetting. He was both jailer and prisoner, and Mourner's Hill had always been the cage. But now the mirrors were gone. There was only raw stone and the rhythmic breath of the house, and in the distance something approached, footsteps, slow and barefoot. Crane rose. He knew who it was. Elias emerged from the far end of the corridor. He was not older, but he looked aged, as if time had folded inside him. The same childlike features, the same stillness, but behind his eyes now stood authority. "You remember," Elias said. Crane nodded. "I remember. You asked why you?" "I did." "And the answer?" Crane hesitated. Then, "Because I couldn't let go." Elias stepped closer. "Because you fed it." Crane looked down. His hands, once calloused from labor and prayer, were stained black. Not with blood, with ink. Centuries of signatures, permissions, denials. Always the administrator, never the martyr. "You wrote their names," Elias said gently. "Not because you hated them, because you thought you could contain it. And I failed." "No," Elias whispered. "You succeeded. That's why the door opened. Because you never stopped believing you could fix it." Crane's breath shook. "Then let it end. Let it end." Elias tilted his head. "It can, but it must be earned. No more cycles. No more rebirth. One final name, one final offering." Crane knew before the words left the boy's lips. "Yours," Elias said. "Not signed. Spoken. Freely." Crane's mouth went dry. The air around him felt thicker. The roots pulsed faster, sensing the shift. The house listened. "Say your name, Thaddeus Crane." Not the name written by the church. Not the name repeated through centuries of ritual. Your name, the one buried. Crane opened his mouth. But something held him. A resistance deep in the soul, the same fear that had once led him to the door, to build it, to give it others. What if the void did not close? What if the hunger only changed shape? But Elias stepped forward, touched Crane's forehead. And suddenly, the memory returned. A cabin, a mother's voice, a lullaby in a language forgotten. Before the war, before the vestments, before Mourner's Hill. He remembered the name, the first one, and he spoke it. Not aloud, into the house, into the door. The world changed. The corridor folded in on itself. The roots pulled back like retreating veins. The floor beneath Elias splintered, not from decay, from release. The chapel above shuddered. The walls sighed. For the first time in over a century, the bell rope snapped. Light poured through the cracks. Not red, not fire. Sunlight. Pure and pale. Crane stood alone now. Elias was gone. The mirrors, the corridor, the weight, all gone. He was back in the chapel. Morning. The door was shut, truly shut. He touched it, cold, still dead. Behind him, the children stirred in their beds. Breath returned to St. Armathas. The walls no longer pulsed. The house had gone quiet, but at Crane's feet lay one final item. A single parchment, blank, and at the bottom, a quill, waiting. The quill's tip glistened, though there was no inkwell in sight. The parchment before Crane was impossibly smooth, untouched by dust, its fibers humming faintly with a quiet tension, as if it too was holding its breath. He knelt slowly, fingers hovering just above the paper. The children were stirring behind him, unaware of the night's rupture, the presence that had nearly consumed them. Mourner's Hill was still standing, but something had shifted. The door was closed, and yet the parchment remained. Was this forgiveness a receipt or a test? Crane sat cross-legged on the chapel floor, the morning sun casting pale beams through fractured, stained glass. Each ray touched the altar, the pews, the crucifixes, but not the door. That ancient slab remained untouched by light, as if light knew better. He picked up the quill. No ink, but when he pressed it to the page, it bled. His name did not appear. Instead, a symbol, a spiral, slender and long, curling inward infinitely. Not a letter, not a mark, a command. The page absorbed it, then began to blacken at the edges, and from the parchment a voice rose. Familiar. Lillian Hart. She begged you to stop, it whispered. Crane's throat tightened. She offered herself in your place. He saw her again, standing at the threshold, hands open, eyes full of unspeakable sorrow. Not pleading, knowing. She entered the door because she thought you were worth saving. Crane slammed his hand over the page, breath ragged. The children's footsteps grew louder, some were humming. The house no longer echoed them with malice, but it remembered, and so did he. He stood abruptly and walked to the door, the same door that had taken so much, returned so little. It looked smaller now, not just in height, in presence, as if drained. He placed the parchment against its surface and whispered, I'm done feeding you. Nothing happened. Then the parchment burned. No fire, just heat, a searing hiss. When it dropped to the floor, it had become ash, but the spiral remained, etched into the stone beneath. Crane staggered back. From outside the chapel came a soft knock. He turned. 3 children stood at the threshold. One clutched a wooden toy lamb, another a stitched doll. The third wore a tattered blanket like a crown. They did not look afraid. We saw the lights, the tallest said. Crane nodded slowly. You're safe now. They entered. No hesitation, no haunting, just children, barefoot in the cold. They walked to the pews, sat in silence and looked to him with eyes filled not with fear, but with expectation. He understood. The house was no longer hungry, but it was still hollow. It needed new memory, new ritual, not blood, presence. He lit a candle, then another, one for each child lost, one for each name forgotten. The chapel grew warm. He wrote in the new ledger, no blood, no spiral, only names. The first, Elias Monroe. He paused. The door behind him creaked. Not ominous, not opening, settling, as though sleeping. He turned to it one last time. I remember now. And the door did not answer, because it no longer needed to. Crane left the chapel doors open as the sun rose fully over Mourner's Hill for the first time in decades. The snow line receded. Birds returned. The mountain exhaled. The children played in the fields by midday. No new names were whispered, no walls bled, no bells rang without hands. But still, deep beneath the chapel, in the place where roots once pulsed and mirrors once screamed, something old lingered. Dormant, not gone. Only waiting, not for another offering, but for a reason. The thing beneath Mourner's Hill had gone quiet. Yet it had not died. It had not been banished, exorcised, or destroyed. It had simply been denied, and denial, like hunger, is a silence with sharp teeth. For now it waited. Beneath stone and ash and chapel hymns, it folded in on itself, remembering every name, every cry, every moment the door had opened and something had been offered. Above, life resumed. Crane restored the orphanage, room by room. The rot in the west wing was carved out. The cracked beams in the bell tower were replaced. The attic was sealed and blessed with holy water and salt, and no child was permitted near it again. The children, fewer than before, but present, learned to laugh again. Elias did not return. Neither did Lillian. Not visibly. But sometimes, in the quiet of dusk, Crane would hear humming from the eastern hall, the same lullaby Lillian once sang. He did not follow it. He let it pass. Some memories are not to be exorcised. They are to be honored. But peace is not without its price. And one morning, as the sun painted Mourner's Hill with soft gold, a letter arrived. It bore no seal, no return address, just a single line. "Is it true? Did the door stop?" Crane burned the letter without reading further, but he knew it would not be the last. For years, the church had sent its wounded to St. Armathas, pretending it was for the children, but the church had always been afraid of the mountain, afraid of what they had buried, afraid of what they had invited. The Vatican codices called Mourner's Hill an exceptional anomaly, others a consecrated rupture. But Crane knew the truth now. It was a wound, and he had been the scalpel. At night, Crane wrote in the new ledger. Not just names, truths, not scripture, but story. What happened, what was hidden, what the church refused to believe. He included every sin he had committed in the name of protection, every child taken, every soul bargained for, every name spoken at midnight. He wrote it all. He hid the book in a false drawer behind the altar, sealed with 3 locks, each forged from the melted metal of the door's former hinges. He placed a single crucifix above it, turned upside down, not in blasphemy, but in warning. Years passed. The children grew. Some left, carrying only faint memories of a winter when the chapel whispered. Others stayed, becoming caretakers themselves. The hill bloomed in spring and slept in snow, and for a time, the past held its tongue. Until one afternoon in autumn, when a child named Miriam, no older than 7, stood before the chapel door and tilted her head. She didn't touch it. She didn't speak. She only listened, and Crane, watching from the hallway, saw the faintest ripple move across the wood, like breath, like recognition. Miriam turned to him and said, "It knows I'm not afraid." Crane said nothing. But that night he returned to the altar, opened the hidden drawer, read the first page of his account, and wept because he understood now. The door would never be satisfied, not because it hungered, but because it remembered, and every memory leaves behind a trace, a scent, a shape, and every so often it finds someone who matches it. Someone not afraid. Crane closed the book and looked toward the chapel's ceiling. A faint line had appeared in the plaster. Hairline. Barely visible. But it hadn't been there yesterday. The door was shut. The house was silent, but the hill was waking. Crane rose at dawn, as always, but there was something brittle in the air. The mountain wind, usually soft in October, had become jagged, dry, metallic, like breath passed over rusted blades. The trees, tall and silent as sentinels, leaned slightly inward now, toward the chapel, toward the door. The children didn't seem to notice. But Miriam did. That morning, she asked to help light the altar candles. Crane hesitated only a moment before handing her the taper. Her hands were steady, her gaze unwavering. She looked at the crucifix and said, "He's not the only one who watches." Crane tried to smile, but the crack in the chapel ceiling had deepened. Not wide, not long, just deeper. At noon, the birds vanished, not flew away, vanished. One moment, their song curled through the stained glass like incense. The next, silence, the kind that hurts the ears, the kind that knows. Crane returned to his office and retrieved the ledger. He added a line. The door remains shut, but the hill listens. He ran his hand over the cover. The leather felt warmer than it should have. Not burning, not pulsing, just awake. Later that evening, he found Miriam standing before the closed chapel door again. Her palm hovered just inches from the wood. She wasn't touching it. She was feeding it. Not with blood. With thought, memory, possibility. "Miriam," Crane said gently, "what do you hear?" She turned slowly. "He's inside." "No, he's gone. We closed it." She shook her head. "Not him." Crane froze. "Then who?" She looked past him toward the pews, as if seeing someone who wasn't there. "You." He stumbled back a step. "What do you mean?" Miriam stepped closer. "He's in you now. You said the name. You finished the circle. You closed the door. Yes. But you invited him in first. That's why he's not gone. He's buried inside." The air around her thickened. Candles flickered, and from beneath the chapel floor, a sound began to rise. Not a moan, not a scream, a chant, dozens of voices, layered, ancient, each speaking a name over and over, the same name, Crane. Miriam placed her hand on his chest. Her skin felt impossibly cold. "You're the door now." Crane backed away. "No, I ended it. I sacrificed." "You delayed it," she said. "Then what do I do?" She pointed to the spiral still etched in stone from the burned parchment long ago. "It's not a seal, it's a map." Crane turned to the symbol and realized it wasn't curling in, it was leading out. The door had always opened inward, consuming, harvesting, but the spiral, if followed in reverse, led away from the center, away from the mouth, away from him, a way out or a way deeper. He didn't know yet, but he would. That night, Crane wrote no entry. He did not sleep. He sat beside the door, hand resting on the stone, tracing the spiral with one trembling finger. Miriam sat across from him, quiet. At midnight, the spiral glowed faintly, and for the first time, the door whispered not a name, but a question. "Do you wish to leave?" Crane did not answer, because he didn't know. He looked at Miriam, who now stared not at the door, but through it, as though seeing a path stretching far beyond the chapel walls, a road carved not by feet, but by intention. He knew then. The door wasn't asking for sacrifice anymore. It was offering choice. But choice, like hunger, demands to be filled, and Crane was still full of names. Names he had whispered, names he had signed, names he had forgotten. They stirred inside him like sleeping serpents, each one coiled tight, waiting to be called again. But now the door had changed. It no longer hungered for others. It hungered for him, not to consume, to know. He had been its gatekeeper, its echo, its choir. Now it wanted him whole. The spiral on the stone throbbed faintly beneath his fingers, glowing with a dull amber light. Miriam remained across from him, her eyes never blinking, her expression unreadable. She seemed impossibly still, like a portrait nailed to time. The door's question remained. Do you wish to leave?" Crane thought he had already made peace with death. Years of penance had dulled his fear. But this wasn't about death. This was about exit, about abandoning the shape of things, about choosing to become something else, or nothing at all. Behind him, the children slept, peacefully, blissfully unaware of the threshold on which their guardian now stood. He closed his eyes. In the darkness, he saw Elias. Not as he last saw him, but as a child again, barefoot, laughing, unburdened. He stood on a shoreline with no sea, holding a small paper door in his hand. "I told you," Elias said. "It was always your name." Crane nodded. "Then why did I keep coming back?" Elias let the door float from his hand. It burned without smoke, because even the damned believe they can be forgiven. The light faded. Crane opened his eyes. He stood. Miriam rose with him. "I can't leave the children," he said. "You won't," she answered. "Not all of you." Crane reached for the door. Not to open it, but to enter it. There was no knob. There never had been. It opened when it recognized. When it was recognized, and in that moment, it knew him. The chapel pulsed once. A final heartbeat, and then the door opened. No blackness, no fire, just light, amber, gentle. It did not pull him. He walked willingly. Miriam watched, and as the light swallowed him, the chapel ceiling groaned, the spiral on the stone vanished, and the door closed one last time, not with a thud. With a sigh. The crack in the plaster sealed. The candles stopped flickering. Silence returned, but not empty. Full. Whole. And at the altar, where once lay the cursed ledger, there was now only a single page, written in Crane's hand. "If the door opens again, it is not for hunger, it is for return. Do not fear it, remember me." Miriam folded the note. She placed it beneath the altar cross, then turned toward the sleeping quarters. Outside, snow began to fall. Gentle, clean. By dawn, the children would awaken and find the world untouched. The chapel would stand, the hill would rest, but somewhere far below the earth, deeper than roots and relics, something ancient stirred. Not in anger, not in longing, in recognition. Crane had not escaped. He had transformed, and Mourner's Hill had accepted him. In time, Miriam would become caretaker. She would walk the same halls, write new names, sing new lullabies, but she would not be alone. The house had memory now, and in the flicker of candlelight, in the hush of midnight winds, she would hear it. A voice, not haunting, guiding. And when the next child approached the door, curious, trembling, small, Miriam would know what to say. She would kneel, take their hand, and whisper, "Let me tell you a story about a man named Crane." And so it began again. Not as a cycle, but as memory preserved. Not a curse passed down, but a history held. Mourner's Hill did not forget its dead, nor did it pretend they had not once screamed. But now it remembered with gentleness, with reverence. The children at St. Armatha's grew under Miriam's watch. She was not a mother to them. She was something older, a steward, a witness, and though she rarely spoke of the night the door closed, her eyes carried the weight of those hours, and a promise never to allow it again. Yet time, as always, moved onward, and the world beyond the hill began to whisper. Rumors filtered through the towns below, of an orphanage where none aged past 13, yet none were seen leaving, of a chapel whose windows never frosted, even in winter, of a girl who never blinked when asked about the missing priest. In 1873, 9 years after Crane stepped through the light, a man arrived at Mourner's Hill. He wore no collar, no badge. His coat was threadbare, his eyes suspicious. He said he was sent by the archdiocese, but bore no letter. Miriam met him at the gate. "You've come for stories," she said. "I've come for answers. You won't like them." He followed her anyway. The man explored every room. He interviewed every child. He touched every stone of the chapel door, and then, at midnight, he returned to the gate, pale, silent, distant. "What did you see?" Miriam asked. "Nothing," he whispered. And then he left, but that was not the end. In 1875, 2 children vanished from another orphanage in Pendleton. No signs of struggle, no footprints, only a spiral drawn in chalk on the floor of the dormitory. In 1878, 3 nuns fled a convent in Idaho, claiming they had seen a door in their chapel that had not been there the night before. By 1880, the church began closing orphanages across the Western Territories, quietly, without explanation. No inquiries were made, no protests allowed, but Mourners Hill remained open, because Mourners Hill was no longer theirs. It was hers. Miriam, now in her 3rd decade of guardianship, remained unchanged. She aged, yes, but gently, as if time itself was reluctant to touch her. Her hair grayed, her hands weathered, but her voice remained soft, firm, enduring, and the door, the one that once whispered names and devoured lives, had become something else. A mirror. It showed nothing. Unless you asked, and only those who already knew how to ask were shown anything at all. Miriam never allowed anyone to open it, but sometimes, when the chapel was empty, she would sit beside it and read from the ledger Crane had left behind. Not aloud, just silently. Line by line, and when she reached the last page, she always added one more line. A truth, a name, a mercy. And so the ledger grew, not as a record of doom, but as a scripture of warning, a tale of what happens when silence is allowed to starve and secrets are fed instead of healed. By 1902, Mourners Hill had become a place spoken of only in whispers. Cartographers erased it from newer maps. Locals referred to it as the Quiet Peak. And in a way, it was. Quiet, but not forgotten. Because stories do not die. They become doors, and somewhere, always, someone is reaching for the handle. But on this hill, in this place, the door remains shut. For now. And behind it, memory sleeps, not in fear, but in waiting.